Good evening, and welcome to the Pac-12 Access to Justice series. My name is Marcilynn Burke, and I'm the Dean and Dave Frohnmayer Chair in Leadership and Law at the University of Oregon School of Law. And tonight, I am delighted to host a conversation with Vice Provost for the Division of Undergraduate Education and Student Success, Kimberly Johnson, here at the University of Oregon. And tonight we're going to be discussing her best-selling novel, This Is My America, and also talking about the role of the narrative in social justice. And so I didn't ask Vice Provost Johnson what she would like for me to call her during this hour. So what would you like?
You can call me Kim.
I can call you Kim.
Yes, I'm using my author hat mostly, so with Kim is good.
Okay, so Kim, in her role though as Vice Provost, is responsible for setting the strategic direction for undergraduate student success efforts at the University of Oregon, and that's a very small job, and so she has a lot of free time, and thus has authored this best-selling novel, which explores racial injustice against innocent Black men who are criminally sentenced and their families are left behind to try to pick up the pieces. So she is an award-winning novelist, including winning the 2020 Malka Penn Human Rights Children's Literature Award. And we'll talk about some other things that have developed from this wonderful book as we go along tonight. But I wanted to start out with why we came to this theme and to inviting Kim to be with us tonight. And I want to thank our Associate Dean for Faculty and Research, Jen Reynolds, who really helped me see that this would be a really interesting way for us to talk about access to justice issues. So when we heard about the series, we immediately thought about Kim and her new book, right? Because I mean, there's so much in her book. And if you haven't read her book, you need to read her book. Okay, that's the first thing. You need to read her book, and I am not receiving any royalties or anything for that. I'm just telling you, your life will be enriched by reading this book. And her book has been called Harrowing and Worthwhile, Beautiful, Honest, and Courageous. And I think it is all of those things. And, earlier today, I was listening to the book. And I read the book, long ago when it came out, and I was listening to the book. And so I know the story. I know how it ends. And a very good friend of mine called me, and I decided not to answer the phone because I wanted to keep listening to the book. That is how good it is. So I want us to start out, Kim, if you could perhaps read us a passage from your book and sort of set some context for us for these themes of justice and injustice, if you will.
Yes, thank you. I just want to say thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really excited to be here with you and everyone who's viewing today, because my work and how I sort of came to my work, and we'll talk more about that. An interest in the law has always been a huge factor and influence of my work. So I'm going to start from my novel. It goes throughout the novel, there are a series of letters that Tracy Beaumont, who is a 17-year-old protagonist in the story, writes to Innocence X, which is an organization that gives homage to the Equal Justice Initiative and the Innocence Project. And so I'm going to start off by reading one of her letters and then a portion of one of the chapters. That's maybe around the fourth chapter. So it starts off with Stephen Jones, Esquire, Innocence X Headquarters, 111 Justice Road, Birmingham, Alabama, regarding death penalty intake department. Dear Mr. Jones, my dad has precisely 275 days before his execution. You're the only hope we have because every lawyer we've used has failed us. In the last appeal, Judge Williams didn't take more than 5 minutes to consider. We mailed a renewed application since it's now been 7 years. Please look into James Beaumont's application number 1756. We have all the court and trial files boxed up and ready to go. Thank you for your time, Tracy Beaumont. So I'm going to read a scene in this novel where it has Tracy is home with her family. She just met with her brother, who is her older brother named Jamal, who as we get into talking about the book, you'll learn a little bit more about Jamal and his role in this story. I'll begin. I lie restless in bed and listen for movement. The air is thick and hot. There's heaviness in the atmosphere, like so many nights when the past takes over the present. I try until my brain is just the wave of an old smell, a phrase someone says that can put me on high alert. I've never been able to get over what happened enough to live fully in the now. Always rush back to the night Daddy was taken from us, a moment that won't erase. My sense of deja vu is heightened by the sound of a vehicle riding down a quarter-mile gravel driveway. I listen more closely and my heartbeat picks up, throbbing when I recognize there must be 2 or 3 cars driving way too fast for our road. A minute later, a knock at the door jolts me. I run down the hallway to the stairs. Get back to your room. Mom is already at the front door. She waves me away. Who is it? I mean to whisper, but I'm yelling. She looks through the peephole and rests her face on the door. I see the lights flash blue and red before she confirms it. Police, Mama whispers. She doesn't need to say more. Something awful has happened. Corinne meets me at the stairs in her rainbow pajamas. She clutches her thin arms around me. What is it, Tracy? Everything is fine. Go back to bed, I say, although I'm holding her as tight as she is me. I want to let her go, but I'm frozen. My heart is beating in my throat, pounding, thrumming out through my ears. Over my shoulder, I glance at Jamal's room. There's no way he's asleep so fast. Inside, I'm tangled up, searching for a reason why they're here. If I was standing by Jamal, we could look at each other without saying a word. Just know it's them that's wrong, not us. But something went down with Jamal, and whatever it is, I sense I should let him be. I leave Corinne and make my way downstairs, my Know Your Rights training kicking in. Mama waves me back, but I don't stop. I'm concerned it's gotta be about Daddy. He's hurt, worse. And it goes on, but I'll stop so we can sort of jump into our conversation.
I'm supposed to be ready to ask you a question, and I'm just drawn into the story once again. Like my heart is beating, and this is part of what I listened to today. So it's not even like this was months ago. This is part of the story that I was listening to today, and one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you was about the power of the narrative and how stories can really connect people, and also at the same time persuade people. So we as lawyers like to think of ourselves as being very creative and very good storytellers, but we're nothing compared to storytellers such as yourself. So I wonder if you could share with us a little bit about how you came to this project.
Yeah, I mean, I started writing about 10 years ago. And I've always known myself as someone who is a good orator, a good public speaker, someone who has always had stories in my head, but never actually writing them down. And my identity as a writer was basically non-existent. It wasn't a thing that I actually hold. But a lot of it and how I came to this story as I started to begin writing young adult, as I found that it was a space really, really ripe for Black voices in particular, but diverse voices that have not actually been heard. And working with young people as we do, working in a college environment, you have that energy of hope and dream and possibility and change. And so a lot of that was happening with me in terms of thinking about this book right around the time of 2015, where Black Lives Matter was being called around the country and students were engaged in activism. And those of us who are old enough to remember Rodney King, that was for me as a young person, 12 years old, around that time, the first time that I sort of became aware that maybe I wouldn't be safe in this world. and seeing young people sort of go through this awakening for themselves and want to question about what's happening. And a lot of the conversation was on police brutality, but I have always been a student of history. Me and my husband are big book nerds. We pick up Color of the Law like it's, fun reading for the week. Reading Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow was just an interesting sort of thing for us to read. And I've always balanced reading young adult and then reading nonfiction works that tackle really difficult topics. And thinking about the law and injustice and our criminal justice system have always been things that I've been either passionate about and involved in activism or just in conversation and trying to understand. And it really wasn't until I read Bryan Stevenson's Just Mercy, who was an incredible storyteller. But that's not his main gig that we know him of. We know him for his work with the Equal Justice Initiative. And it was through his own narrative that he was telling in Just Mercy that was so compelling to me in thinking about an issue that often is difficult for, I think, the layman to talk about in terms of the death penalty and your feelings of the death penalty and people not willing to really sort of put their stakes on the reasons of the death penalty. And I empathized so much with all of the people that are long forgotten. And that's really what Bryan Stevenson has dedicated his life to. And as a young adult writer, I started to think about the young people who had been incarcerated that he talked about in his story, and the families then that are impacted as they're sort of going through these trials that take decades and decades to sort of resolve themselves. And that's when I really wanted to think about, is there a different way that I can talk about what has been the main topic of concern around Black Lives Matter and actually talk about our entire criminal justice system that has its roots based on racism, its roots based on benefiting from mass incarceration. And that's really where my story came from in writing it in a generational way with a father and a son and a family and those impacts around there. And taking a topic that is very controversial in terms of being able to talk about the death penalty, but really trying to center readers in telling a story of, the death penalty is, something that is final when it actually occurs. And if we know that 1 in 9 people who are sentenced to death are actually exonerated, then there's something wrong with the system. So let's look at the system. And so that's sort of really where my story really came from.
So Kim, you touch on so much there, and I'm just going to go with the tail end there. And that is, we're going to back up to a bunch of other stuff.
Yeah.
I'll start at the end, and that is thinking about the research that you did for this book, right? And so knowing that all those books behind you, you actually read them. And how did you approach, the research, and particularly to try to talk about the legal aspects of the story?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is taking on pieces of topics that I wanted to tackle in my book. And so, I might read the New Jim Crow actually is a really good example because it just talks about the system, the entire system, using Bryan Stevenson's words, slavery didn't end, it evolved, sort of really looking at the sort of bigger picture. But even, Blood in the Water is a really good example of my story isn't about an uprising in a prison. But I really wanted to get a sense about what does it feel like to be in prison? What would it feel like for my main character's father in the story? And so for me, the research was really layered. So it's looking at things that are systemic, and it's looking at sort of elements, whether it's character building or issues and some of those other, pieces, and thinking about what are some systemic things to look at. And you spend, I think, as a writer, it's sort of like an avoidance factor to writing. So for me, is that you just do a bunch of research. And so my story takes place in Galveston, Texas. And I did a whole bunch of research on Galveston, and I looked at actually an FBI case that involved the KKK in the 70s. and really tried to sort of place my story in Galveston, because that is the last location that those that were enslaved found out that they were free 2.5 years after slavery had actually ended. But I don't even talk about that in my book. It's just, I'm setting the scene in Galveston, and all of those cues that are there, and those readers who are aware of that can sort of get that deep context. I also, because I came into writing later, I like to use a lot of mediums in terms of how I approach my work. And that's through not only reading, but listening to podcasts. And, and when I was really doing my revisions and editing, in 2017, I found In the Dark season 2, which follows the story of Curtis Flowers, who had been really targeted and harassed by a prosecutor who, every time that they found a resolution in his case, tried him again. And he's been tried over 7 times, and is sort of finally, actually this year, there's some resolution coming from that. And listening to that particular podcast, and then listening to series and series and series of other podcasts of those that have been wrongfully incarcerated, or even those that were really sort of young and got sort of caught up in the system, but had sentencing that seems to be unfair with their situation, and realizing the pattern. And for me, it really was like, how can I take all of these things that are happening in the world and engage those patterns, and film and television and media and documentaries were ways. And then, of course, interviewing people. So my sister, my younger sister, is a lawyer as well. She's practiced at large firms. She has worked in the Federal Trade Commission. She went to Bolt Law School. And when she was at a firm in New York, she took on death penalty cases. And of course, she tells me that like halfway through I'm writing the book. She's like, did I ever tell you about the case that I helped with? I'm like, no, I've been searching for people to interview who have worked on death penalty cases. And so it's funny how those pieces in your life are already there, but you don't quite know. And she actually connected with me with one of her other alum who worked with Brian Stevenson as an intern on many different death penalty cases. And it was really interviewing him and having a lot of those pieces, and then working through it, and then having my editor say, you're gonna need to cut 50 pages because young adults are not gonna want to read legal proceedings. They're like, they don't care about the file case. They don't care about the appeal process. Like high level, Kim, high level. So all of that sort of like is in there, and then ends up creating a novel, and then thinking about your main readers, and really what you're trying to get to at the story of being like, okay, this isn't a crime. This is not a criminal procedure story. This is a story with heart and love and activism and all these other things. So center that.
So I think that you've said a lot about writing that law professors certainly that resonate with us, like how we're avoiding things, getting to the tough writing part by continuing to research. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you have to say, when do I stop researching and start writing? And so that definitely resonates with me. But I want to talk about a little bit more about you personally and how you came to this story, because you grew up in Eugene. And you're talking about, 2015 and Black Lives Matter, and you graduated from the University of Oregon. And neither one of those things or places make me think the heart of Black Lives Matter, right? So what was it in your own experiences that was really driving and motivating you here?
Yeah, so for anyone who's on who doesn't know Eugene, it's in Oregon, and it's a predominantly white community, as in we're maybe less than 2% Black. And when I was growing up, it probably was like 0.75% Black. It was me and a couple families that we were here. And as a young person, like a very, very young person, 5th and 6th grade, I wasn't around a lot of other people in my classes, especially who look like me. I often was either the only person of color in my classes or the only Black girl at minimum in my classes. And in Eugene, that for many probably suburban communities, people experience their community differently. They either try to sort of like fit in as best as they can as a survival mechanism, or they rebel, or they do sort of like, it's difficult to find yourself. And for me, I found myself with activism. I saw something that was wrong, that I didn't think was fair, and I was heavily involved in it, and, you know, joined the NAACP. I traveled all years of high school to the summer national conference. I was a chapter youth president. Jamal Bryant was the person who, when I was in high school, that was like when his career was starting, and his voice invoked all of these sort of feelings of fighting for justice and being engaged, and then through college, just being someone who was really heavily involved. And so a lot of that is just within me, and studying, being an ethnic studies major, and having sort of ingrained. And, you know, what I saw with our students here on campus was wanting to be a part of making change, wanting their community, but also I think mirroring what you're seeing, you know, mirroring issues that, you know, okay, my story is set in Texas. I could have chosen Alabama. I could have chosen Mississippi. I could have chosen a lot of locations. What are the experiences that are happening there that I feel still connected to in my own experience, while they might be different? And so, you know, I think a lot of that sort of came from my larger interests, and I'll get spiritual with you for a moment, but I feel purpose driven in my life, that I have had a calling since I was a young person to be focused on changing people's lives, changing the world in some way. And as idealistic as that might sound, that has always sort of driven the decision making and the ways in which I have lived my life. And I think a lot of it, when I started writing, came out of a passion of wanting to make change, more so than actually came out of a passion of feeling like I was called to write. Now I feel like I'm called to write in association with my interest in literary activism.
Right. So you've sort of touched on this a little bit, but I want to ask you a little to go into this more, why you decided to write it as young adult fiction. Right. Because it's not exactly our college students. But I guess, you know, what is the target audience here, and why did you choose to focus on that audience?
Yeah, for some reason, I love young adult. I will pick up all these books over here are the young adult. These are both some young adult, and then my you know, nonfiction works. And I love their hopefulness. I think because I like thrillers and mysteries, and looking at issues of race and justice, when it's looking at the adult world, it seems like it's finite. Like I already know where that path is going. I don't see that change. I don't see things getting different for people who are my age and older. And when I look at young adult, they have this sort of view on life that everything is just so weighted. Everything is so important, and it's the first relationships. It's the sort of the first time they're using their voice. And it feels like there's so much life there and so much possibility. And that's why I've really, really gravitated to young adult. And there's so much there, you know, especially with this work, is that I don't write, you know, I think there's a lot of assumptions of young adult that, you know, that you sort of are writing at a level that isn't accessible to older people, you know, that there isn't sort of an interest that's there. And I write to things that actually impact people's lives. And we often assume that those things don't happen to young people, and they do, and they are experiencing all of these things. And so yeah, I really enjoy writing young adult. You know, I definitely will approach writing adult at some point, but I think that my home will always be, you know, young adult. And then if you get to college, then you're getting into all kinds of stuff that I don't even want to get into. Like I don't want to even get, like, I'm a little innocent and stuff, like, let me keep some little innocence with my little high schoolers that I write about. Let me write about that, and you know, not focus on that other stuff.
Right. Well, that's funny because sometimes I think I want to work with undergraduates because they are still more hopeful sometimes than law students are. But what drives students to college in general and to law school is this desire to make a change, a positive change in the world. And, we've had Gallup studies about that for law school and the university. We've studied that as well. And so there is still that hopefulness that we have. And I want to let people know that you can write questions in the Q&A, and we're definitely going to reserve time at the end for questions. I saw someone had their hand raised, but if you could use the Q&A feature, then we'll definitely get to those this evening. So what kind of reactions, you've won awards already for the book. What kind of reactions have you gotten from readers?
Yeah, I mean, it's been really amazing because the readers are of all ages and backgrounds. So, I've had a 70-year-old white man who emailed me and was like, I've never read anything like this before. Thank you so much. I'm buying it for everyone that I know. Like, I didn't think that was going to be I didn't think I would ever get an email that would say that. The most exciting really has been from teachers, educators, who tell me about what it's been like to now pick up this text and all the different themes that they can bring up to class in ways that they felt they weren't sure how to approach before, and they felt that it had everything that it needed in that. And so that's been great. And then my favorite is just hearing from young readers, especially, and the youngest group that I've had share that I've been at a school event for was 5th and 6th graders that's younger than my reader group. My book is older than that. But they made book trailers and they really talked about what was happening in the book using really simplified language, even though I don't use simplified language. Like they would say things like, it's just so wrong how they treat it, it's just like, that's just so wrong how they treat it. And they might not have been able to sort of understand the layers of it, but it's amazing enough to know that they really caught those sort of like basic concepts of it. So yeah, it's been, really overwhelmingly positive. I mean, hearing from colleagues, I didn't sort of imagine that I would be hearing from colleagues who would send me messages about the book and what it meant to them, and listening to the audiobook, all of these things that I just never really sort of like imagined. It's been pretty special.
And so how have you carved out time to write this book? So you weren't yet the vice provost when you wrote this first book, but you still had a very big job. And so how is it, and you have a family, how is it that you carved out time to write?
I'm really consistent with my time. And, I think for a lot of people who are just, I'm sure everyone watching is probably very, very busy as well. But if you're not consistent, then you don't actually get to see yourself building the castle. And that's sort of what I always see is like, I'm at a beach and I'm sort of pulling the sand together and it's like really messy and lumpy. But if you keep at it, eventually it's going to look like a castle. And that's really what I do is I write on weekends. And I have to limit my time because my time on the weekends I want to spend with my family and hopefully relax. Although those past 2 years, there's been no relaxing, but at least leading up to writing my book is that, 3 or 4 hours on a Saturday and Sunday over months and months and months, you become really efficient. And I find actually that there are windows that I will take like a week's vacation. And I'll take it specifically to finish a certain aspect of my book or using sort of the holiday time periods to do that. And I find I'm not as efficient with my time. I sort of waste time. I go on social media, I get another cup of coffee, like all of a sudden what I would write in a 3-hour window is the same that I would write in an 8-hour window that I'm writing. And so it's just really about being consistent over time and having that drive. I can go, really, really heavy with my work and find joy in doing it because I love doing it. But yeah, it's been a lot. It's been a lot, especially in the pandemic.
Oh yeah, during a pandemic. How about that? So it really has been a tremendous reception of the book. It became one of the common reads for the University of Oregon. And now being turned into a series on HBO Max. Can you tell us about anything about that process?
Yeah. So I once I sold my book, I got a film agent, and it's the same film agent that does some really well-known young adult works. Also represents Angie Thomas, who wrote The Hate You Give and some other works. And she, shared my book out with production companies, and I have two production companies that are partnering together that have been done really well with different series. And it's like a long process. Let's like hurry up and slow down for like 6 months, and all of a sudden you get a call and they're like, yeah, we sold to HBO Max, and you're like, awesome. That's so great. That's what I wanted. And I think the thing that's just really amazing, that again, it's just something I just really never imagined. And what I'm really excited about is because so much of when I think about my writing and storytelling, it's all these other mediums. It's watching a TV series, watching a documentary, and they have an interest in season 1 is the book, and then there's so much to spin off, and all the characters in the story to sort of build off these different series. And what HBO Max can do differently than some of the others is just the care and the quality of content and film and music and writing that HBO is really known for. I'm really excited about that, and fortunate that I get executive producer credit. And so, once the script is sort of like being vetted and finalized, I get to be involved more than most sort of like debut writers would, if they, or any, I guess, writer who sells their sort of first adaptation. So.
Absolutely. I was talking with the author, and why is her name escaping me right now? Lilia Bundles, the author of the Madam C.J. Walker story. And it's really turned into a series and about the creative license that they took with her book. So how are you working through that?
I'm nervous about that because there is a certain vision that I wanted, and even just as I do want it to touch on really heavy topics and themes, but I also want it to be, I want a family to sit down and watch it, be able to watch it together and have conversations together. And I just don't want them to make it, something that I'd be like, don't want to watch with my kids. That's the only thing. And so, I think that I get to have voice on it, but they do get to take all the creative license, and I've shared with them what's really important to me, and especially about on-screen representation, and some of the concerns that I have about lack of representation or lack of colorism that often occurs in filming, and some of those pieces that are really important to me, to honor sort of my approach and interest in the work. And so it will be, I do have to sort of let it go, at some point, and what's going to happen is what's going to happen, it was just hard for a creator because I, spent so many years with this book, and there's so many people who they want to see different things. I have people who email me, like, cast this person, and I'm like, I'm just hoping they make sure to call me on casting day so I can at least pretend I had an option. So all of that will be really fascinating.
So Kimberly, could I ask you to read another passage for us, and then perhaps we could open it up to questions?
Yeah, and I think, because we're talking about research and how much time I spent with research, I'm going to give an example of a scene that, taking all the books that I read, and then basically only spending a paragraph to actually write about it in my book. But I feel like all of that I sort of downloaded from my reading sort of like is symbolic in this particular moment. So this is sort of later in the book, closer to the closing part of the book. This is Jamal, her older brother, speaking. Nah, you don't hear me. See all these books. Jamal points around to the scattered books I hadn't noticed are from collections we rotated in and out to Daddy, W.E.B. Du Bois, James Baldwin, Thurgood Marshall, Michelle Alexander, Ta-Nehisi Coates, and a week's worth of newspapers. They all say the same thing over and over again. It doesn't matter when they were written. The laws might change, the systems might look different. The laws might change, the system might look different. All these books say what the problem is, working 10 times harder to get half. Seems to me all the blood that's been spilled ain't our debt, but we paying it over and over again. And the world acts like there's something wrong with us. They hate us so damn much. Jamal's voice is cracking. I'm sorry, I can't tell if I logged out. Oh, I'm still here. Sorry, my computer did something weird. I'm gonna start my sentence again. And the world acts like there's something wrong with us. They hate us so damn much. Jamal's voice is cracking, desperate words that have been suffocating him. 400 years and we still ain't American to them, T. All that blood, we built America. Black labor built the greatest nation in the world for free. They ripped us from our family then, and they do it again with new laws disguised as change. I'll be in prison doing that labor for free. So books and books, and then, you know, a paragraph in a particular moment of Jamal sort of expressing how he was feeling.
Right. And when you originally wrote it, was it a paragraph long?
Oh no, all the I'm long-winded, pages. I mean, so much was cut, so much. But sometimes it was very cathartic because, you know, like when I was heavy in revisions before I had an agent, before I had, you know, sold it to Random House, I would write a scene, and in that scene I would think, you know, are people going to think that I'm being too dramatic, or is this too unbelievable? And then tiki torches in Virginia occurred, and that reminded me, like, no, I am on the right track. And some of it was cathartic of doing that. You know, there was a moment I used to write before the pandemic. I used to write in public spaces like coffee shops and those kinds of things. And you know, at the time there was a coffee shop that I was regularly going to, and a gentleman had his All Lives Matter shirt, his sort of signaling red hat, his computer on with sort of all these sort of messages, and just chooses to sit right in front of me and just stare at me, almost like he knew that I was working on what I was working on. And it was cathartic for me to be like, you know, you're trying to be this big man in front of me, but I'm going to work on this book that's going to actually move and change people's, you know, hearts and minds. And you know, all of those things, like I would get it out, and then you would edit it, then I would cut it down and revise it, and it felt like it was still baked into the book, even if it's not on the page.
Absolutely. And I think we were saying being able to tell the story, and as we're talking about the use of storytelling in persuasion, and you know, we've had that intuitive sense, we've had that anecdotal sense, but you know, there's lots of research about this actually, about how our brains respond to stories and how we can actually, how we become in sync or synchronized with the story, with the storyteller, and how that can bring you along so much more quickly and thoroughly and persuasively than just the facts. Mm-hmm. Right. And so thinking about that and thinking about the way in which we teach law and the way in which our students experience the classroom, to take that time to share some stories, I think is, you know, thinking about that a lot in thinking about your book and how we can connect to each other. More importantly, right? That it doesn't have to, we're so polarized in this country, so divided. Right. Mm-hmm. But if we start sharing stories, that we will be able to see each other more clearly and to connect. So I'm really grateful to have you. And I'm really grateful that you wrote this book. And it's really important. And we're only seeing the beginning of HBO Max is just the beginning of even what this project is doing. And as I've said to you before, please remember me as you go on to your your fame and fortune. So I'm going to open it up for questions now. And I have a question from Debbie Sharp. And she's asking, was there a part of this book that was more difficult to write than others? As a reader, I know what was the hardest part to read, but I'd be interested to know what was the hardest part to write.
Yeah, I mean, when I meet with readers and they talk about, certain scenes that, caused them to cry or were very sort of upsetting, I cried while I wrote. If there's a scene that invoked emotion, probably 9 times out of 10, I had tears streaming. There's a scene where the family is having dinner and an incident occurs at their house. I mean, I was bawling and shaking because it invoked so much in me. And I questioned, should I include some of these sort of historical pieces? And part of it was like, I would not be authentic and honoring the work if I didn't show the past as present and the present as past in my work. And so some of those scenes, I had to do. There are moments that was very intentional when you talk about storytelling. My purpose of writing and having people sort of empathize with characters and their experiences was that her father, James Beaumont, is in a well-known prison where typically you actually would, as a death sentence, you typically wouldn't actually be able to be in the same room without sort of like barriers and those other kinds of things, and visits were limited. But it was important for me, for the readers, to get to know James Beaumont, that he was more than someone who has been incarcerated and sentenced to death, that he's a father, he's a husband, he's a community member. The scenes where the family would visit and they would hold hands, or he would comfort or even joke with Tracy, acting like he sort of knew all the things that were happening in his life. All of those were really emotional for me because I thought about my family and my father and what that would be like. And it's really important to me that I sort of like also bleed into the pages, in a way emotionally, so that readers can feel that. So,
Right. And I believe Leah Crandall had her hand up some time ago. So if Leah, if you are still here and would like to ask a question, I'm going to unmute you. Okay, now Leah, you have to unmute yourself. Okay, don't know what's happening. So while we're trying to figure that out, I have another question for you, Kim. And that is, how did your lawyer sister respond to this book?
yeah, no, she really enjoyed it. I mean, she is able to separate her sort of like legal hat, and jump into sort of the emotions of the story. I mean, I think the only thing that I've ever heard is like, it would never happen this fast. And I'm like, I know, but this is a young adult book, and I needed this case to sort of like go over a 7-year time period, because those of you that study wrongful incarcerations, I mean, it's not strange to hear of 30, 40 years that the case is being worked on. But yeah, she enjoyed it, and she enjoys young adult too. So she also sort of loved some of the softer, more closer scenes about relationships and life and some of those pieces. So yeah.
Right. I loved the scene when Tracy is visiting her father, and she says she puts her head in his hands. Mm-hmm. She did as a child. Like those kind of moments are really really touching and also difficult, right? Mm-hmm. To recognize that this is the only way in which she has that contact with her father. And no problem, Leah. She raised her hand by mistake. No worries. Mm-hmm. But I do have another question from our audience. And this is from Hannah. She says, it feels like it's nearly impossible to care enough about all of the crises facing our country right now, especially related to our criminal justice system and the legal system. How do you recommend coping with activist burnout?
Mhm. Yeah, I've worked and mentored a lot of young people, and even sort of myself in working in organizations. And any organization that you work with, they have their vision and goals, and that guides their work because they know that they can't solve everything and they have to have some direction. And I think it's the same thing for us as individuals. You know, if you have someone who is a law student, or you know are actually practicing, or you know within the field, I think it's about connecting what's most important to you and what do you think that you can actually make impact in the book. I really try and model a lot of different ways to show activism, so that the only image isn't just protesting as the only form of activism, but you can actually do more. And so Tracy writes letters to Innocence X. That is a form of activism. If she just did that and wrote letters, like that could be enough for her. She's a budding journalist. You know, she has her own Tracy's Corner, where she writes op-eds and educates people on issues happening within the criminal justice system. That's one way. She runs Know Your Rights workshops to help people in the community. And I think it's about identifying what area that you can focus in. And so if you are a prosecutor, and that's the field area that you're working in, what can you do within your own community, your own, you know, your office work, you know, the field, you know, in conferences, what can you do to really move things forward from a social justice perspective, you know? So I think that there's a lot of different ways to do it, and trying to sort of prioritize like what you actually can feel that you can do, because you can't tackle it all. There's no one who can actually tackle it all. And sometimes about going like local. What's in your community? What's in your school? What's in your, you know, field? What's in your state? As ways that you can sort of like influence and make change.
So, Kim, I was thinking about burnout actually when I was thinking about asking you to do this. and and I was thinking, you know, you've done made all of these appearances talking about your book. And do you as an activist, how do you deal with burnout, or even in talking about this labor of love, this first book?
Yeah, I mean, I am a work in progress in in learning how to say no. It's been a challenge for me because I lean into yes more, and I'm just getting better at saying, you know, saying no, and knowing what's realistic on my plate and what I can do. And you know, the interesting thing when you're doing this work, especially in the time period of starting in 2020 with the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, a lot of people wanted to do something, right? And you know, what I find really interesting is that sometimes you get asks from people to do things that are, you know, just not really understanding that I probably get a lot of asks, you know. And so is like, you know, with all the things that I'm doing, and if you believe in my work, if I say I'm so sorry I can't do your book club of 3 people in your community, it's not because I don't think it's important. It's just because I have I have other things that I do, and I have to have some discernment about what schools will I go into, you know, how many schools will I go into, how many talks will I prepare for, which takes a lot of time to do, because I want to have, you know, meaningful talks when I'm giving a talk, and you know, what's the reach that I can do. And so for me, this kind of one, I love you, you're great, you're wonderful, so of course I'll say yes. So that's one, like, actually know me, right? The access to people who are interested on and want to make change, you know, the kind of influence that can happen. That's what I want to see. Like, how far will this work go if all these other people, like, that's my own putting into the bucket of justice, is can I use my work to help fuel other people interested in doing the work? That can be my contribution. So yeah, it's learning to say no, still learning to say no.
So I imagine that people also have come to you and asked you about how to get started. Like they want to explore their more creative, the creative parts of their brain, their activism, their reform minds. And so what do you have to say to people who are thinking this is a way for them to sort of get energized and hopeful and continue moving on?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just about, like you're saying, carving time to do it and not being so overwhelmed with the task of achieving something and going more incremental of like, for me, it was learning how to write a sentence with appropriate dialogue tags. Like I didn't know how to do that, so then I learned how to do that, learning how not to do a bunch of backstory. Okay, learning how to tell a story in a different way. First, I've had a lot of young people talk to me about how can I start a Know Your Rights workshop at my school. And so like talking to them about, well, like this is how you can start a club or an organization. And in Tracy, it didn't matter if one person showed up or 10 people showed up. She was still going to do it because she knew the impact. So then how can you not be upset if you do all this work and no one shows up? Okay, what are you going to learn from that so that then it's improved and that like you're doing that? And so there's all kinds of ways I've had like really, really incredible conversations, but the fun one has been those that hear my story of how I got to writing and how much of a negative experience it was for me as a young person and how much that has changed for me, and them sharing their own stories about their feelings about writing and why they never felt that they actually could explore their own creativity in this way or something else totally different, that they were like, wow, if you're doing all these things, I guess I probably can find time to like figure out how to do this other thing, and so that I think has been really, really meaningful for me in being able to help other people sort of see the possibilities that can happen within themselves.
So what is next?
Yeah, so I am finishing up my next young adult novel, which is called Invisible Sun. And it is similar themes to This Is My America, but it focuses on a 17-year-old Black boy named Andre, who is sort of put in this terrible situation of having to go to a juvenile detention facility and coming out of it through community monitoring right on the heels of the pandemic. And it has a mystery to it. It's based in Portland, and he's a character that's very different than Tracy. Tracy is an activist and she's ready to go. And Andre doesn't want to be involved in all the sort of like discussions on Black Lives Matter that was happening at the time period because he just wants to worry about himself and sort of like expressing himself. So yeah, it's really focused on that. I've been really blessed to be connected to a lot of Oregon juvenile justice change makers in the state, which has been really exciting to see because it really touches on those issues.
That I'm ready. I'm ready for the book. I'm ready for the book. And I was thinking if you might want to write a book about Tracy going to law school and you need some consulting work, that I
know who to call. Yeah.
You know who to call, because I will be here. And so I'm really grateful to have had this time to share with you, Kim, and to talk about how stories can connect and persuade and your process and all that went into writing this book. It really is tremendous. And I would like to thank our Associate Dean of Faculty Research and Programs, Jennifer Reynolds, who's behind the scenes here, and also to thank Dean Elizabeth Cronk Warner, whose this great idea was to have the Pac-12 Access to Justice series, and to all of the people at the University of Utah who helped bring this all together. So with that, I'm going to say good night to you all. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you so much.